All right, so we're working on cylinder heads again today. If you watched my last video, you know I talked about basic gasket matching. You take your intake manifold gasket and spray some paint over the head, pull it off, grinds down to where the paint is. You can see we've got a nice square hole. And I just took that Dremel I showed you, just took sanding wheels, like a fine grinding wheel, then a sanding wheel, and just smoothed out the metal a little bit. Didn't really do anything crazy. I just tried to clean up those rough castings as best I could. The next thing I want to talk about is your intake valves and your combustion chambers. So here is the cylinder head apart, and you can see, of course, it's all covered in carbon, but if you clean this carbon off, what you would find underneath is, you know, like your skillet in your kitchen, it's cast iron, has a rough texture. Rough textures are not great because they can develop what's called hot spots, iron heads especially, and they can have a bit of a, what's the word I'm looking for, like pre-ignition, pinging, engine knock, things of that nature. It's not good. It's not good. You don't want it. But here's what I did with this other head. Now this actually didn't take that long. This is where it does pay to have an air compressor and some air tools. I started off with the Harbor Freight Dremel. I got some grinding wheels, and I just went down and gently just started working down the metal, just to the point where, you know, it's a little bit shiny, so you can still see there's a few little pits here and there. That's just the texture of the iron. I didn't want to take off too much. Now, when you do a combustion chamber polish, the more material you remove, the lower your compression ratio will be, because the more metal you grind out of here, the larger the combustion chamber becomes. You're digging a hole effectively, and the more you dig, the bigger the hole gets. So we're just trying to do the least amount we can get away with, and you start off with like a fine grinding wheel and just carefully, you know, chip away at that rough casting. And then these really come in handy here. These little whiz wheels, I love these things. I can't recommend them enough, but you do want a big air compressor. So if you've got some air tools, you want to go to the next level. After you're done grinding, you will get a sanding head like this. Start working these areas down, and then you'll get one of these little cookies here with a weird texture. I forget what they're called, forgive me. They get one of these weird little cookie wheels, and it kind of polishes it up. And you should be able to have it to where it's like smooth to the touch. That's what we want, is smooth to the touch, and that is, you know, better. It doesn't change much. You know, this adds 1 horsepower, and then the porting and polishing adds 5. It's not really a lot in this particular context, but you know, everything accumulates. If you do 100 different things that add 1 horsepower, you've just added 100 horsepower. Every little bit helps, and it all adds up. The next topic of conversation is intake valves. Here is a stock new intake valve. There's the old dirty ones. But if you rub your thumb across here, that's really rough in texture. But also the back side of the valve, if you rub your thumb across this, that also has a rough texture. And as you know, when it comes to fluid traveling across surfaces, the rougher the texture, the more turbulence, resistance, whatever the word you want to use, the more turbulence you create, the less efficient the system is. So, in a nutshell, shiny is good. So what I've done is, I just took my little that little cookie and just kind of cleaned up the bottoms of the intake valves, but I've also done the tops. Now, if you look at these guys, the way the light is reflecting off of the valve, you notice how it makes like a vortex? This is by no means perfect, but that's what you call a swirl polish. And achieving a swirl polish, like a basic level swirl polish on an intake valve, is actually really, really, really easy. And I'm going to show you how. Let me prop up my camera here, and I apologize, the last video I didn't realize my head was right in front of the camera, so that was bad. So I'll make sure to be a little bit more careful this time in filming this, because I want you to see. But basically what we can do is you take your intake valve like this, and you just rest it on your knee. So really simple stuff. So take the intake valve, rest it on your knee, and set your cookie wheel kind of like this, at a little bit of an angle to where you're touching try to get it to about where you're touching pretty much that whole surface. So just kind of go back and forth, get a feel for it. And you want to be kind of touching everything because you want to polish from here all the way to the lip. So what you do is you rest on your knee and you turn it, and you use your kneecap as a lathe. So now when we look at that valve, it's still on the ground here next to the other ones. Again, this does not take that long, but now look, we've got that vortex going. If you look at the reflection of light, you can see the vortex. So that is just kind of a very bottom tier basic swirl polish. And if you run your finger across it now, it feels very smooth to the touch. And the philosophy behind that is with the swirl polishing, it's supposed to come and whip the air off of the surface of the valve. I don't know how well that works, but what I do know is that having a smooth surface is better than having a rough one. Same with your combustion chambers, same with your intake ports. On a low performance build, the exhaust ports really don't matter anywhere near as much because those are operating under positive pressure. You know, your intake ports operate under vacuum, and vacuum has its limitations. So if at the surface of the ocean, at sea level, surface of the earth, your air pressure is about 14.5 psi. So if we call that our baseline, if we call that 0 for the sake of argument, the most amount of vacuum you can possibly achieve is negative 14.5 psi. But when it comes to positive pressure, there is, you know, kind of colloquially speaking, no limit to how much positive pressure you can create. That's why intake valves are always bigger than exhaust valves, because exhaust valves are the high pressure side. You don't need a huge exhaust valve because you've got positive pressure. The piston is literally pushing out. But when it comes to the intake side, it's operating under vacuum, and we have a strict limitation of atmospheric pressure if we're ignoring the fact that turbos exist. So that's why we have bigger intake valves and smaller exhaust valves. So the importance of polishing these runners is to eliminate that turbulence, to squeeze out as much airflow as possible, because again, when it comes to atmospheric pressure, there is a very strict limitation on how much air can possibly move through a system when it's under a vacuum. So like when you buy an Edelbrock carburetor and it says 600 CFM, that is 600 cubic feet per minute, CFM, cubic feet minute. So if you hook up that carburetor to a big vacuum cleaner and you're sucking air through it, under a total vacuum, the most amount of air that's likely going to flow is 600 cubic feet per minute. That completely changes with turbos and superchargers because now you're creating a system of positive pressure. But that's just a little bit of rambling about some basic engine theory and little things you can do for your budget builds to make little bits and improvements here and there. And I'll probably post some more videos of the International motor as I go along. So until we meet again, stay gold.